Extruding objects in Illustrator. So when we look at a two-dimensional graphic or a two-dimensional object, 2D means it has two axes. And if I turn on my rulers, Control R, I see that I have my X and my Y, and those are the two axes, my X being my width and my Y being my height. And I always tell people to remember that when you shake your head no, if you shake your head no, you are moving your head back and forth on the horizon. That's the X, like X means no. And when you shake your head yes, you move up and down on a vertical, which is the Y axis, and that means yes. Now, not all 3D softwares use the X, Y in that same orientation. Some of them will flip that. Now, when we talk about 3D, now we have three axis, which is a Z, the added Z, which is the depth, like I'm walking in or walking away, backing up. So the 3D tools in Illustrator, we're going to look at one of them here, and that's the Extrude. Extrude and bevel. So what this will do is apply a 3D effect to a 2D object. So if I select my square here, I'm going to go under the Effect menu to 3D, Extrude and bevel. So I see now my extrude, my 3D extrude and bevel options dialog box. The first thing I am going to do is preview. Let's check to turn on the preview. So let's explain a little bit about what we see here and how that affects my three-dimensional object. So one of the things that you notice probably when I turned preview on is that Illustrator automatically will shade my object according to how this 3D effect would work. So that's an automatic feature that Illustrator has. And once again, we have our axes here. We have our X, our Y, and our Z. So with any of these, I can rotate or I can change. I actually can click out here in this little circle preview, and you can see that my edges will highlight, and that also allows me to move this so I can see some of the different surfaces at a different angle. So width is the X, H is the height, and Z is the depth, which is always perpendicular to the front in Illustrator. So in my dialog box, if I navigate to the lower portion here, I have extrude depth. The extrude depth is the degree of extrusion, and that just means how far is this thing going to get pushed out. So it's measured in points, and obviously the greater the points, the more it's going to be extruded on that Z-axis. So if I increase this, you can see that, of course, having my preview checked, I can see that this is being extruded quite a distance, and it goes way up, so we can have a very, very long extrusion here. So let's go back down to something a little bit more reasonable. We'll land around 117. Now at the end here, I have caps. There are two options for caps. Basically, one is on and one is off. So when I have the cap turned on, which is the default, my front and my back surfaces, I am not able to see my back at this point, but those two surfaces are solid. If I turn this to be hollow, I'm turning my caps off, and so now that makes the front and the back faces invisible, so I'm able to see through. And if I rotate this around a little bit, you can see it's actually a hole going through it. The shading, of course, helps us understand that three-dimensional object. Rotating, back up here, what I had mentioned earlier, I tend to like to go right here in the preview and rotate it if you know the exact dimension, the exact amount, and you can also drag here as well. So you can either enter in a number, drag in your individual X, Y, Z, or drag in the preview right here. Okay. And notice that my surface shading will update as I move that around. So now if I click OK here, it will be applied. In a later lesson, we'll talk about mapping art. This allows us to put graphics or other illustrative pieces on the surfaces. One other last piece here, it has surface, and this is the surface shading. So this allows me to see how my lighting and coloring effects are applied on the frame here. So if I go to wireframe, I'm just seeing the wireframe. It's a little bit distracting with my actual box, my original square that I started with. We still see that. Because the 3D extrude is an effect, I can turn it on and off. I see it in my appearance panel. So my original really is not disturbed or harmed. I can still go all the way back, take this effect away, and have my original object. Wireframe would be used if you're having some memory issues. No shading basically will extrude it, but it's very difficult to see what kind of shape we have, especially if I turn my caps on because it looks like all one solid color. Diffuse shading, okay, is just a little bit duller than a plastic shading, and sometimes it's harder to distinguish between those two. Okay, so diffuse just meaning the light's diffused a bit. Default is plastic shading. All right, so I'm going to click OK here for the moment and deselect, and here's my object. Now if I navigate and find my appearance panel and extend this, you can see the 3D extrude and bevel. If I highlight my object here, this, and I can turn this off, I can turn this on. So it is an effect. It's non-destructive at this point. Now the more complex you get for your objects, the more interesting this effect becomes. So let's once again go and notice under my effects menu, it remembers the last effect that I applied. So I actually could go ahead and click right there, and it will apply the same effect with the same settings that I last used. And so here's my star extruded out. Of course, these are editable. So I can go back into my appearance panel and I can click on that effects, get right into where those settings were at, and I can change this. Of course, I want to turn preview on so I can see what's going on here. So it's editable. I don't have to think that, gosh, what I set is going to be there forever. I can certainly change that. Okay. Now, how about applying it to some more complex things like text and a compound path? Let's first start with a compound. So I have two circles here. Let's just drag them off a little bit. I have a red circle and I have a yellow circle. We're going to create a compound path with these two objects. And remember that a compound path basically has an area that becomes knocked out. So what happens is this top object is going to knock out the back object. So under my object menu, compound path and make. All right, so now, and again, you can see this one in layers. If I go to layers, I can look at my sublayer here and it definitely says compound path. So it acts as though it's one object, although it's still editable individually. So with that selected, let's go ahead and go to FX, 3D, Extrude and Bevel, turn on my preview, and there you can see, very interesting because I have sort of a hole through it. So however complex my compound path is, you can then apply the bevel, the extrude, we're going to do bevel in a moment here, and get some really interesting effects. So just remember that the more surfaces the object has, the more interesting that 3D effect is. So how about the beveled edges? Let's go ahead and show some more options here. So here I can choose to play with my shading, which lets us play with my light source. So if I move my light source here, you can see how that affects. You can make a little bit more drama in your image if you would like. Okay? All right, so here is my bevel. So my bevel, I have a number of different predefined shapes. In fact, there are 10 of them listed here. So we start with none, which happens to be the default. So a bevel basically means the angle that one surface makes with another when they're not at a perfect right angle. So right here I have this surface meeting this surface of the inside of this compound path. So we're going to look at the edge here. Same thing as right in these two surfaces, the front surface with this rounded edge surface. So that's where my bevel is going to occur. So when we apply this to the edges of an extruded, you get some interesting effects. Now here you can see that the bevel happens. This is a more of a traditional, a classic bevel. We can get into some complex, which gives the effect of ridges. All kinds of interesting things here, some of them more visible than others, and it's really going to be more of a play around with it. Now there are some times when that bevel will not work and you'll get some errors, and I'll show you when we get to text that might happen. Let's do a classic bevel. Now my height basically controls the width of this beveled edge, so if I increase this, you can see that the beveled edge increases to the point where I lose my surface plane. It kind of diminishes that. So you can play with your height. The other option here is to bevel the extent in or bevel extent out. So bevel extent out adds the beveled edge to the object. Bevel extent in basically carves away from the edge of the existing object. So if we do the bevel in versus the beveled out. So the beveled out actually will thicken or increase the size of your object. Okay? So those are some options there with the bevel. Let's go ahead and click OK. And there's my object. Now, how about text? The cool thing is I do not have to convert my text to outlines. I can extrude text without converting that. So let's go to Effect in 3D and Extrude and Bevel once again. Turn on my preview. I'm going to show fewer options so I have a little bit smaller box here. Look at how easy that was to put text in 3D. So very, very easy. Now this though, when you start applying some of your bevels, this can be hard, and look at what happened in my M. The bevel was, the math couldn't be worked out. So it's sort of a mathematical error that happens, and we get these weird daggers kind of coming out of my M's. You might be able to control it by decreasing this a little bit, and going down to 2 actually pretty much solves it. You can play with the beveled in, beveled out. Beveled out will extend it, and you might have a little bit better luck going with a bevel, although here we're having some issues in my D. So be cautious with that. Sometimes we get some errors. Depending on, you might have to play with settings, tweak them a little bit. Here you can see I do get an error. Bevel self intersection may have occurred, and that's where those kind of mathematical errors are happening. But all in all, it's a very easy process, very simple. Remember, I can rotate this if I want to. Be cautious though when you're creating things like infographics and posters that you don't go overboard with the 3D. It's one of those things that occur kind of like a rainbow gradient and too many stars. 3D, use it as though you would salt your food. Don't overdo it. A little bit goes a long way with this effect.